A purposive sample, as the name implies, is when we're going purposefully to try to find the people who are most relevant for our topic. So we don't actually always want everyone to have an equal chance of being sampled in a sample. Sometimes we want to go directly to the people who can tell us the most about our topic. So for instance, Kenley, in his project in Ghana, he didn't just go to any doctors and talk to them. He purposefully was looking for doctors who had an interest in traditional medicine and maybe used some traditional medicine as well as some modern or Western, however you want to describe it, medicine. Okay? So a purposive sample, and this is actually a good one. You can put that in there. You can say in your proposal, I'm using a purposive sample, and it sounds fancy, right? I mean, basically what you mean is, I'm just going to go find the people who can tell me what I want to know, right? So, but it makes it sound good to the AMS committee, like, oh, this person must know what they're talking about. They're going to do a purposive sample, right? Snowball sample is basically what you do when you have a couple people you know you want to talk to, but that's all. What you're doing is you're using the first few people in your sample to give you additional members of a sample. So if I were to talk to those first few doctors, if I was Kenley, and I knew them but I didn't know anybody else, I could say, well, can you recommend anyone else who I could talk to about this topic? And they give you a couple names, and then you ask the next people if they'll give you a couple more names, and that's where the metaphor of the snowball comes from. Each time you interview somebody or talk to somebody, you're adding more people to your overall sample. Okay? And again, in a way, that's kind of purposive because if you start off with the people you want to talk to, hopefully they're going to know more people along the way that you can talk to about that same topic as well. Okay? So these are not randomized. These are potentially subject to bias, right? Because think about a snowball sample. If you talk to somebody and you ask them for their opinion on something, and then you say at the end of the interview, can you tell me somebody else I can talk to? They could say, okay, I have this friend you could talk to. That friend, because they're friends, might feel the same way about it, right? And then they tell you their friend. So you might be just going around this friendship or social network of all these people who kind of think the same thing because they're in the same network. We know from social science research that people who are friends have a lot of similarities with each other. So a way around that might be to say, can you recommend a person I could talk to that would agree with you about this topic? But could you also recommend somebody who might not agree with you? And that way we can try to get a little bit more broader sample from that non-probabilistic technique, non-randomized technique. Whew, how are we doing so far? Questions at all? Is it time for some push-ups? I think it's time for some push-ups. All right, everybody stand up, come on. We can all do 5 push-ups, can't we? No? You can do the kind where your knees rest on the ground if you want to. Some people call those girl push-ups, but I'm a feminist, so I'm not going to use that gendered language. So let's do it. Find a spot, 5 push-ups. There we go, that's the spirit. Doesn't have to be pretty. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That better?
I have a question.
Okay, Brad's got a question.
I have 2 questions. So one is, for the non-randomized sampling techniques, can you kind of use like a combination of all 3 in a way?
What's that?
You use like a combination of all 3 in a way?
No, not necessarily. You use the one that's most appropriate for your question and the situation that you're in, yeah.
Okay.
So those are 3 different choices, but you wouldn't use them all in a given project necessarily.
Is there any particular reason why you wouldn't? Any contraindications, I guess?
Why you wouldn't use one, or why you
wouldn't use like a combination? So let's say like you have, like a purposive sample where you're looking at people who are representative of the population, like some leader in the group, and you talk to them and they know other leaders as well, like distributed through like a really big place. And along the way you also decide, you know, that's great and all, but I also want to sample what for such a crude term, the commoner thinks. You see what I'm saying? So like also while you're going from point A to point B, you sample along the way and you get other people's opinions.
Right.
which would be kind of like
you could do that. Yeah. No, I mean, especially the combination of the snowball and the purposive, the first part of your scenario, I think is a good combination. Convenience we want to avoid unless we absolutely can avoid it for the most part, because it's so subject to bias in that way.
It's like whoever's there.
Exactly.
So let's say you're in the field, and how would you do a randomized sample in the field of a geographic location that is not necessarily that large? So when it comes down to like picking out spots, if you did a simple random sample, you can't actually have like statistical significance between like each data point if you were trying to like geolocate your stuff.
You can, but you need one thing. Do you know what you need? I said it on the previous slide. You need a good sample frame. You can do a randomized sample usually if you have a good sample frame. In other words, some kind of list or some enumeration of the people or the cases that you want to sample from. If you don't have that, it's harder to do a randomized sample. And especially if you're in a developing context where maybe they don't have good records about things like that, it might be more difficult.
Okay. Yeah, because I've definitely seen a situation where like no such list actually exists.
Yeah. Then you've got to go to probably the more non-randomized approaches. Okay. Other questions at all so far? Right, we're about to go into the actual methods finally. Like I said, we didn't get to these right away because we had to figure out this other stuff first. What do we want to know? What are the variables inherent in that? Some ideas of maybe how to measure them. We're going to get to that a little bit more. And who do we talk to? Those all come before this, but now we can start to think about the methods that we actually want to use. And so that's the next step. So we basically have three types that we're going to talk about briefly today. Survey research, interviews, and observation, participant observation. These are all ones that I cover again in my sociology and anthropology class on research methods. So we spend a whole semester, and actually we're changing our curriculum now, so we're going to spend a semester and a half talking about these different methods. So we're doing this in one afternoon, so it's really, really compressed. But overall, survey research is typically used when we want to have a big N. Again, we want to have that breadth. We can give out a lot of surveys. It's a relatively efficient way to get a good snapshot of a large population is what we want to use survey research typically for. We have to be really careful about doing survey research, though. I think sometimes students think survey research is straightforward, but it requires a lot of careful planning in advance. Otherwise, if you send out a survey that's flawed because the questions are asked poorly or you didn't do your sample right, you're basically wasting your time and the time of the people who are filling it out because you can't really go back and redo it again. So survey research requires a lot of forethought and a lot of planning in order to get it right. And typically, this is the type of research where we use statistical analysis for. So this is where we're going to do kind of our tests of significance or things like averages, medians, stuff like that. Interviews, basically just a different type of survey. We're, again, asking people questions and collecting and analyzing those responses. But usually, when we talk about interviews, they're not quite as structured as a survey, where you give someone a specific question and only a limited set of answers. A lot of less structured surveys, or what we sometimes call semi-structured surveys, we actually give the respondents more flexibility to answer in a more open-ended way. So we're not just saying, can you check off A, B, C, or D for this question, but we give them a little bit more room to tell us more stuff. So in that respect, it's harder for us to get a lot of cases, a bigger N, but we might actually be able to get into a little bit more depth, like I was saying before, with our answers because our subjects don't actually have to just check off the boxes. They can tell us stuff, we can respond to that then and have kind of a conversation. That's more ideally what an interview is like, and we can get that kind of depth. And this is the one that I'm the most familiar with myself. I do a lot of interviews in my own research, so I've probably done more than 100 interviews with all different types of subjects in my research. And so I have a lot of experience with that, and that's the one where I can give you the most kind of first-hand knowledge, probably. Okay? And then the last one we'll talk about is observation, participant observation. This is one, I'll say a little bit more about this when we get to this slide. This is one I think is appropriate for everybody's AMS project, no matter what you're doing. And I'll say more about that, what I mean by that in a bit. But basically what it involves is kind of seeing what's going on, observing, as the name would imply. Or in some cases actually participating in a particular activity as a way of learning more about it, and then being reflective, recording notes on that, and looking for patterns in those. This is one where we have to really kind of be careful about how we see things and how we record things, and kind of more in the moment versus a survey, which we're doing everything ahead of time and trying to anticipate. An observational study, you're more kind of in the moment and seeing what's going on in a place and a time, right? Okay, so the first one, survey research. First step of survey research is operationalization. Big word. Basically what it means is taking our variables and thinking about ways to measure them. Okay, so we talked about some examples of variables earlier. We talked about tourism and economic development, right?